So introductions, myself, we're gonna have Vanessa talking about mapping, and then of course, Donna, Freya, and emergency management coming through afterwards. We are open to questions happening throughout the presentation, so feel free to raise your hand. We do, because it's being recorded, we are going to be passing around a mic to be able to manage that. So I'm going to start it off. How did we get here, and what are the next steps? Like I said, this is the third presentation in the boundary region. So we did the west boundary, Area D, rural Grand Forks in September, and then the Area C here. We are looking at, we received, RDKB received grant funding in 2020 to be able to start the process of updating floodplain maps. Floodplain maps are usually updated every, well, they are supposed to be updated every 10 to 20 years, or if you have a major event. Because of a 2018 and 2017 event, that was the trigger that all of the mapping and all of that work needs to be updated to see if you've had any major changes. So it's been something that's been happening across the province. It is being the responsibility of the local government, and for us to be able to do it, we end up having to apply for grants in order to get the funding to do it. Otherwise, it's just to make sure that it doesn't come from the cost from the taxpayer within the region. So everything of this has been grant funded. The municipalities, we've got 3 municipalities in the boundary region, Greenwood, Midway, and Grand Forks. They applied for the grants in 2019. They were successful. RDKB wasn't successful. So they have their flood mappings already done. We are now trying to fill those patchworks of those areas within the RDKB area that didn't get done. So that's sort of the goal. We weren't able to do all of the priority areas within the RDKB boundary region. We just didn't have enough money in the grants. So we are going to be looking for more money into the future. So we still have to do the Granby, and there's certainly some areas up in the west boundary that still need to be done, to be completed. So last year we applied for 2 grants, NDMP and the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, to be able to get this flood mapping done. We were successful with both grants, and so that's how we managed to do what we've been doing. What they do when you apply for these grants, you have to start with a flood and geohazard risk assessment. They won't let you do any floodplain mapping until you've done that. So that was our first grant that we did in 2020, and that has allowed us to go to the mapping. And I will speak mostly about that risk assessment that was done, because of course we've got Vanessa here to speak about the current mapping. So with the risk assessment, the reason why they get us to do this is because they want us to be able to have that third party or that high level look at where your priority areas. Sometimes people can get a little bit pigeonholed with, oh, I'm sure this is a priority area, and not see maybe that other one, that other spot there that could be also in dire concerns. So they did a regional flood and geohazard risk assessment by Ebwater and Palmer. I was really keen on having that geohazard component because in the boundary, we have those very erodible soils. And so we wanted to be sure that we had that understanding of what was the erosion potential, what could be the debris flow concerns, and including the flood work. So when they do a risk assessment, they do it based off these 6 characteristics. Now, that risk assessment has been complete, and that is on the RDKB website. So I think I had the link just on the, the page right there at the top there is the link where that completed document is. We are doing a story map of the whole process, and so that's also going to have those links as well with you. So then what does it look like? So at the end of the day, they do all this calculations, and they look at all those 6 characteristics and say, where are all the priority areas? One of the things that they did for that geohazard, they said, what are all your potential for your debris flow, debris flood, fluvial hazard risk? Now, this is a very, very high level mapping exercise. So LIDAR. Are people familiar with LIDAR, digital elevation modeling? So what it is, it's a topo map. So it's like your contour levels, but at a really, so it's like a 1 meter contour level. So it's a really, really detailed mapping. It's pretty new. 2015, I'm going to look over Vanessa. I think they started, I think it's when I first started seeing them coming out. They're much better quality now. Anything that's done in 2018, 2019, 2020 is a higher quality than the stuff that was coming in at 2016. But what they've done is the boundaries got a lot of this really high level contour mapping. And we're hoping, I'm looking over at Donna, we're hoping to be able to get some of these high level contour information on the RDKB website. So the only problem is it's very data intensive. And so that's sort of where the limiting factor of that is. But we were able to use that with the screening tool to be able to come up with all of the areas. So what they looked at was your fluvial hazard. So that is like, what's your range of, if you had a log jam, what are the erodible areas? A lot of it's a calculation. And then the bigger systems, what they're calling as high order, they used LiDAR to say, you know what, we're sensing a problem in this area. This is probably where we're seeing it. And so any of the purple here was mapped with a lot more intensity. And then your debris flood and debris flow. And I think Vanessa might talk a little bit about those, but it's just the level of debris that is coming down from a big flush. Does anybody know about a debris flood or debris flow in this region? McCrae Creek, right? So, and that's that whole basis of all of a sudden the sediment, it's blocked. Sorry, not Mike. The sediment's blocked, and then you've just got that big flush of water and material that comes down. So that's sort of that debris flood, the potential. So I just wanted to, I know when we first received this report, so this report then looks at the population, where is the density, what is the value, and so that's sort of how, again, this was just for prioritizing where the flood mapping should go. Mandatory for doing any of the grants in the flood mapping. These are very high level, and this is not, there's no likelihood. So the mapping that was done with this risk assessment, it's not a likelihood. So it is just a potential location based off contours and some soil type, high level soil type mapping. It's a desktop study, not ground truthed. So nobody can use this information as a way of assessing concern, but it's more of a trigger of saying, hey, there might be something there. But yes, you need to have a likelihood in order to understand it. This could happen, an event could happen in this high level in 2 years or 8,000 years. So really understanding the variation of that. That's it for me. So that was just a really quick look at the risk assessment. And so then what that did is they provided us with a number of areas that are now considered high priority. With that information, we're allowed to now start applying for grants to be able to get the flood mapping work done. So this is happening all over the province. And yeah, and then one of the big things that we're noticing here is that we have different engineers for the different areas. And so that's been also quite interesting. Just as everybody is sort of teaming together. Okay, I'm going to pass this over to Vanessa. Is there any questions?
Got it. Can everybody hear me? Are we good online?
Yep.
Perfect. So thanks for having me, everybody. My name is Vanessa McMaster. I work for Northwest Hydraulic Consultants. I've been one of the main project engineers doing the floodplain mapping for your lovely lake. Thanks for hosting me tonight. Sorry I brought the snow. That was unintentional. Yeah, all the way from Nanaimo. So I'll just give you a brief idea of what we're going to talk about through this presentation. I'm going to do the first half, and then my colleague Dale, who supervised the whole project, is going to give us the second half. If you have questions at any point, just wave a hand, shout it out. We can pause and answer questions, or if stuff comes up online. So first we'll start with a little bit of introduction, background. Kristina covered a bunch of that for us. We'll look at some of the hydrology for the area, talk about the hydraulic analysis, the coastal analysis for Kristina Lake, the geomorphic hazards, how we developed the floodplain maps, and then kind of the typical roles and responsibilities with the RDKB going forwards, kind of what happens next. And then we have time for questions too at the end. So as a really quick introduction, NHC is a consulting firm across BC, Alberta, and the Western United States. Started in Edmonton, been around for about 50 years now. We specialize in water hydrology and hydraulics. We've done numerous floodplain mapping projects for rivers and lakes and coastal areas all over BC and abroad. We're supported with a number of geoscientists, GIS specialists, hydrologists, engineers. And so this work today is being done obviously with the regional district, particularly Kristina and Donna. So thank you so much for their support. So why do we do floodplain mapping? Well, this project has been initiated to reduce the risk of flooding. That is to reduce the likelihood and the scale of harm and hardship to the community from flooding. The project is to develop floodplain maps that illustrate the extent and the elevation of suitable design floods that incorporates the most current channel and floodplain geometry and the current hydrology in the region. So the resulting floodplain maps are meant to inform basically everybody here, everybody that lives, works, and owns property within or near the floodplain, as well as land use planners and emergency response. So why do we do this? There are a number of ways to deal with floods to reduce flood risk. You can have non-structural approaches and structural approaches. Floodplain mapping is considered a non-structural approach, and it provides the base information to support the identification, design, and implementation of most structural and non-structural flood risk reduction measures. Therefore, your maps need to be current and preferably high quality. So let's talk about where we are. This is, I mean, you guys know, but areas in floodplain mapping, as Kristina described, there were several areas identified as high risk. So as part of this project, we split Carmi and Beaverdale, we did Rock Creek, done the Grand Forward Reach, and now we're on to the final leg, Kristina Lake. Now, there are existing maps in several of the locations in the RDKB. There are existing floodplain maps for Kristina Lake. So we get the opportunity to compare our new results to our old results, which is great. It's a good sanity check on our new results. There are many places still in the RDKB that don't actually have mapping. You can see the green, they're like, I'm not even sure what color that is, brown, gray, orange squares on the map outline the old maps, and where we've outlined in red is where our new reaches are going to be, and we'll have new boxes for the new lines soon. So Kristina actually talked about this quite a bit, so I won't go into it too much. This is the previous information that was done by Ebwater and Palmer. So this is your debris flow and your debris flood risks all across Kristina Lake. Your debris flow is purple, debris flood risk is orange. I'm actually not going to talk about the debris flow and debris flood, but Dale will, and he'll define them for you. It's a percentage by volume. It'll make more sense when he talks about it. So let's get into the hydrology. So Kristina Lake level was gauged by WSC for 43 years, which is actually a pretty long time. Unfortunately, from 1944 to 1990, they stopped gauging it in the recent years. I wish they hadn't done that. But it's still relevant. It's still useful to us. The data was analyzed and we used it to confirm the highest lake levels typically co-occur when there's flooding from the Kettle River. So what this means is Kristina Lake can flood independently all by itself, but it also typically floods with a backwater influence from the Kettle River. So the Kettle River comes up, reverses the flow of Kristina Creek back into the lake and then infills the lake. A fairly unique problem across this province, and one that makes Kristina Lake an interesting challenge for sure. Therefore, it took we had to hydraulic model it specifically, and it was I'll get into it. It was very interesting. But before we talk about that, let's talk about some of the gauges that we looked at for the reach. Now, the Kettle River plays a critical piece for Kristina Lake. There are 3 gauges kind of within your proximity. 2 gauges on the Kettle River, 1 on the Granby. For Kristina Lake and this lower piece of the Kettle, we did look at the gauges upstream, Kettle River Ferry and the Kettle River at Grand Forks, but we mostly focused on the Kettle River at Laurier, which is the gauge just on the south side of the border, on the American side. So these are you can see the gauges I've the one circled is the one we focused on, but those are the breakdowns of all the watersheds for Kristina Lake and the surrounding area. So as part of this analysis, we always look at the flood history. So right here, we have a figure that presents a timeline of the annual peak flows from the Kettle River. As part of our analysis, we looked at all the historic floods that have occurred since the gauges started recording. 2018 is the biggest flood on record, and we estimate it sits around a 200-year event. There's evidence actually recorded at Laurier Gauge of a potentially larger flood that occurred in 1894, but the evidence is limited to a high water mark. There's no flow data associated with it. But if they've made estimates of what the flow is, but there's a really high uncertainty in the estimates of the flow because it's so old. But the box sitting up there kind of gives you a range of what the possible flows was. Now, actually, the 1894 event is the flood of record on the Fraser River all the way over in the lower mainland. That was a really, really big flood event. There is a correlation between water level and flow. May have differed substantially during the event compared to the current correlation. So really, really old historic data may not be accurate in today's date, especially in today's current configurations of the rivers. But the figure illustrates potentially high flows experienced in 1894 and where we were. So this was that line straight across was where we were in 2018. So there's still a potential that there was a bigger flood once upon a time. So once we analyze all the historic data, we move on to how do we determine the design flow of the river, which in BC is typically our 200-year flow. So this figure illustrates, it's a statistical plot plotting the record of annual peak flows, which are all those little black dots, with the average return period in years along the x-axis and the average flow along the y-axis. So we do what we call a frequency analysis, where we look at the whole record and then we plot it with these distributions, and then we fit a line through it. So the blue vertical line indicates where the 200-year design event would fall, and the horizontal blue line indicates where that best fit value is. So that's how we determine what the 200-year flow is. Now, the dashed red line, that's more orange, sorry. The gray line that fits on either side of all those black dots is the uncertainty band. So that's how far out the answer could be given that. And so we take it roughly in the middle. You can see from the red lines, or sorry, they're orange. My screen is no good here. That's the range, as I said, the range of uncertainty. So your flow actually could be like up to like 200 CMS roughly more, or 200 CMS lower. So like there's actually, when you look at a 200-year, there's actually like an applicable range, but we choose just one value to represent what we think hopefully is the most representative, but there's always a certain level of uncertainty when dealing with real information. And we plotted the purple point there is where they roughly estimate the 1894 event to be and the associated uncertainty with it. So now that we figured out what the design condition is, we've been talking about existing conditions. Now we kind of have to look into the future. So global temperatures have been rising in recent years. They're projected to further increase over time. Based on the regional studies, this is expected to result in an increase in winter precipitation and a decrease in summer precipitation, as well as a decrease in snowfall, as more of the precipitation tends to fall as rain. The changing climate is projected to result in more frequent and intense extreme rapid rainfall on snow events. So we used a hydrologic model to project the climate change over land cover for a bunch of future conditions. The impacts of land cover is actually expected to be on the range of 3 to 6%. That's the expected increase. Snowfall is, as we said, going to decrease, but what does this do to our design conditions? Now, we discovered that there's actually not a statistically significant trend of increasing flow in the current data. So climate change for the spring freshet is not likely to see an increase on the Kettle River. However, sorry, let me rephrase that. That's likely due to the decreasing snowpack and accompanying countering more of the precipitation is going to fall in the winter as in summer, and it's going to fall as rain rather than snow. So there's less snowpack and there's less supply for the spring freshet coming down. However, projected into the future, we did see an increase in peak flows that may occur in winter. So we might actually see a timing in the shift of floods from spring to winter. So this is more like what the coast sees in the lower mainland, the November 15th event, for example, in the Coquihalla. Those are winter events. So they're typically caused by intense rain on snow events, similar to all the coastal mountain ranges. So to account for this, we've applied a positive skew line. So what this means is the best fit line is adjusted, skewed up to account for the fact that your events are going to switch from a classic spring dominated flood to a more typical winter dominated flood. This means we roughly have a 15% potential increase for climate change. So once we have all these flows, we move to the hydraulic modeling stage, one of our initial steps in development of the floodplain maps. The hydraulic model is created for the Kettle River and Kristina Lake from Cascade Falls to the US border, and the mesh extends all the way up and covers all of Kristina Lake as well. We created it in HECRAS, which is a computer software built to simulate rivers. We use land cover, such as what you see here, and we classify it into all different roughnesses, so the model can understand the different textures of the landscape. And we apply it over LiDAR. Kristina explained LiDAR for us there, light detection radar. Essentially, a plane flies over and bounces light off the ground and it sends returns, and then they create a surface from that. As part of this project, we went out to survey the rivers. We surveyed Kristina Creek, the Kettle River, and actually we pulled historic bathymetry maps for Kristina Lake. So bathymetry is just underwater survey. That's its technical term. So we combined the bathymetry and the LiDAR to create one surface, one DEM that we use to simulate the model. So these models are called digital elevation models, or DEMs. Next, we create a mesh of cells across the surface of the DEM, and then we add inflows at the boundaries. We calibrate the model using historic flow events. So I took all the historic flood photos from 2018, mostly in this case, any high water marks that were collected, any anecdotal information, and I check to see if the model matches it, and then I adjust the model parameters until I have a good match. So from the model, I get water surface elevation. So something interesting to note here is actually the water at the south side of Kristina Creek. It's actually higher than it is in Kristina Lake. So the water is reversing flow there. We get velocities, which basically show how fast the water is moving. We get flood depths. So we know how deep it is everywhere and the spatial extents. And then we simulate the design flood, and then I use the results to create the floodplain maps. So here you can actually see those are little particle tracks that are simulating roughly where the flow of the water is going, and the particle traps in Kristina Creek are going backwards. They are going up towards Kristina Lake. So next, I'm going to talk about the coastal analysis. Now we've assessed the riverine portion, the Kettle River, and now we're going to shift our focus to the actual lake. So let's talk a little bit about the coastal analysis, and then Dale will talk about the geomorph, and then we'll bring it all together in the maps. So the fun part, the lake, so the riverine gets to consider flows. It focuses on the hydrology. Now when we move to the lake, concerned about flows because there's lots of tributaries flowing into it, and the Kettle River flows backwards into it, as we discussed. But the lake also does some other cool things. It has impacts from winds. You get winds that blow across the lake, and then you get waves, everybody's favorite. So for this, we have to consider the wind setup and the wave effects on the lakes, and understanding that depth, and the shoreline geometry all changes how the floodplain maps on the lake are developed. And so we have to include these components. So the winds were a real challenge for Kristina Lake. I started at Grand Forks Airport, realized it's kind of partway up. Sorry, the actual gauge is not at the airport. It's actually supposedly halfway up a mountain, and it's sheltered, and the winds are going the wrong direction. So then I moved to Nichols Station, which is up the Granby a little ways. Supposedly the right orientation. Problem, it's in the trees. So then we moved to Castlegar Airport. Unfortunately, Castlegar's airport is missing large chunks of data, specifically during when storms occur, a lot of times at night. So then we ended up at Penticton Airport. Has a similar valley orientation to you, has lakes on the north side, wide open valleys to the south. So that ended up being the wind data we had to use for Kristina Lake. Now, I know it is 2 valleys over, but when we do see large storm events, you actually are seeing very similar storms as what the Okanagan is seeing. So on like little wind events, little storms, you guys will probably be different than what they see, but when you get to like the really big events, they'll be pretty similar. So we used Penticton's wind speeds to come up with an appropriate wind speed for the lake. And then we developed a spatially varying wind field just for the lake itself based on its orientation. And then we looked at 2 different storm directions. Now we have a lake that's lovely oriented north-south. This means we can have a north event and we can have a south event. And because we have fans that come out into the lake, depending on which side you're on, you'll actually have different exposures. So you might be exposed to a north event or you might be exposed to a south event. So we had to take this into account to make sure everybody was getting the appropriate exposure for an appropriate storm. So we built a wave model. It's called SWAN, simulating waves in the near shore. Very similar to the hydraulic model, uses the depths of the lake, and then we run the winds across the grid to generate the waves, and we propagate the waves to the shore, and we get things like wave height, wave period, and a couple other wave statistic parameters. Now, it's not enough just to calculate the waves. Now we have to figure out how the waves translate on the shore. Now, to turn these waves into an actual FCL that people can use, an actual height on land. Okay, don't worry about it. It's just saying there's an error, but this is fine. To translate these into an actual height on land people can use, we have to figure out how far the waves are actually going to run up your shore. So for Kristina Lake, I classified all your shorelines into different generalized profiles. So if like the beach, for example, at the south side of Kristina Lake, just over here, has one generalized profile for it, which is basically just the slope and how deep the slope goes into the lake. So we break them all up, Kristina Lake up all into all different categories, and we look at the waves and the wave period and the slopes for all those different categories. And we use empirical equations to calculate how far that wave would run up that slope. So these are little example simulations of, this is a complex shoreline, so it's got like multiple stacks on it. So this is already more complex than what we're doing. We had to assume like a generalized profile. But you can see water comes in, water like runs up the slope, and the bigger waves run all the way up. Now, the second simulation down here is actually showing there is a break, essentially. There's an wave energy break sitting out front. In this case, it happens to be, they built like I guess we'll just say it's granular fill sitting out in front with it's got a certain porosity to it. So the waves come in, hit this granular fill that's got a shallower slope, lose some energy, and then they don't run up the wave as high. So it's just to show you that different slopes and different textures out in front of a wave will change how far it runs up. So now we can actually talk about the flood construction level for Kristina Lake. So this is composed of a bunch of different components. We start at the design flood level. We add climate change, expected climate change impacts to it, which is actually already included from the Kettle River. We add wind setup to the lake, Kristina Lake is actually small enough that it doesn't have any significant wind set up across it. So that's basically saying that if the wind was blowing from the south for a long period of time, would you actually see the water level at the north side of the lake rise and the water at the south side of the lake drop? The answer is not to, it'd be like 3 centimeters. It's very, very minor. So then we have the wave effects, the run up we just talked about, and then we have the freeboard on top, which is our uncertainty. So freeboard is meant to account for things we don't know about, local variations in the water, local variations on the shoreline, changes in the wind event, just uncertainty in all the data we use to collect it. Now, you'll see on the maps, there is a light blue polygon line, or sorry, it's a light blue box all the way around the edge of Kristina Lake. This is the waves, the lake zone or the shoreline zone. This is where the waves actually apply to the houses. So waves, typically when they run up the shore, they're going to break on the first set of obstacles, whether that's your house, whether it's trees, whatever happens to be out in front first, and then they reduce energy. And so the people out in front are almost always in the wave polygon area. So what this means, the width of it is set about 15 meters wide, and it's set based on, we started at where the high water comes ashore, the 447.7, and we projected back 15 meters. So this is where the waves have the possibility to come and propagate up to people's houses. Actually, I think about 30 centimeters lower than the historic 1990 levels. But because the historic lake levels didn't include a wave assessment, didn't include wave effects, the FCLs for most of the lake properties are now higher. And Kristina Lake is full of many steep slopes. So many of these run-ups are actually fairly high. So there's been an increase in, I think, all of the FCLs, except a couple for most of the lake. This is where Dale gets to take over and tell you about the geomorphic fans.
Hi, can you guys hear me all right? Vanessa?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, super. So, yeah, I think I can see the side there. Okay, great. So in addition to the inundation hazards, which Vanessa's been talking about with respect to flooding of the lakes or rivers, there's additional hazards that come from the geomorphology, which is basically just the form and processes of creeks and channels and watercourses. So in this slide here, we're just showing some of the geomorphic hazards, such as bank erosion, scour, lateral migration. So that's basically the migration of the banks, as well as avulsion, which is like a sudden or more rapid migration of the channel, and a gradation and degradation. So that's basically increasing or decreasing the level of either a beach or channel. And then there's also the potential for sediment and debris, which could be, both transported as well as deposited in an area. And any of these hazards, they can either occur, as this figure illustrates, either along the shorelines, or it could happen with associated in the riverine areas, as well as span hazards, which are pointed to with the figure arrows there. So you can go to the next slide, please. No. So we looked at these different geomorphic hazards, and I guess just as a description, geomorphology is the study of landforms and processes that develop or change them. And the flow of water, sediment, particularly during high flow events, what has a lot of influence on the geomorphology. Over time, and particularly with changes in the hydrology or sediment and land cover, then rivers can change, as I said, both laterally, vertically, as well as wider and narrower. These changes can occur gradually over many years and multiple flood events, or they can occur rapidly during a single flood, depending on the scale and the rate and the location of these channel changes. These changes could threaten infrastructure, such as either roads, bridges, or homes near the river. So we started the geomorphology using field observations, looking at the sediment and the channels erosion and slopes and topography, as well as comparing historic air photos and reviewing the terrain and modeling results, basically the results from the hydraulic model. So this figure that's shown up here is basically a comparison of historic bank lines that were delineated from historic air photos. So the red's showing, I believe, 1960, and then it goes down to 2018 in blue. So where you can see the different colors showing through, then that's where the channels changed and migrated over time. So you can keep it back on the last part. Thank you. And from this assessment, we've identified that the migration rates, as well as the widening and the channels, relatively minor in this reach. It's not quite as extreme as some other channels that we've done in the area and in other parts of the province. Most of the average rate was close to around 0.1 meters of channel migration per year. Whereas during the 2018 event or spanning that event, there are some localized areas where the migration was as rapid as 15 meters over that kind of event or period right surrounding that event. And so this assessment of these channel migration and past historic bank lines helps us identify where there's expectation of higher fluvial geomorphic hazards. And what we use that for is to help define a setback from the water's edge for where safe development can proceed. So you can go to the next slide, please. Great. So glaciation ended roughly 11,000 years ago. And then during that time, there's rapid aggradation occurred within the river valleys during and immediately following the deglaciation, as large volumes of the glacial drift were deposited at lower elevations as fans, deltas, and floodplains. Since glaciation, the sediment supply is reduced and channel has then incised and resulting in terracing throughout a lot of BC, including this area. A review of the topography and the hydraulic model results for a range of flood zones was then used to delineate what we define as the modern valley bottom. And here we're calling that just the area that the channel has been active under the present day regimes for both climate, hydrology, and sediment supply. And the reason we're trying to map this modern valley bottom out is just because the river's been in those areas in the past, and there's under this current regime, and it's possible that the river could reoccupy that location over multiple events or possibly during, well, I mean, in this area, it's typically more that we're expecting to occur more over multiple events and that are not mitigated or otherwise addressed before subsequent events. So in this, what we've identified, this figure kind of just shows a comparison of different elevation throughout the channel, and that's helping us to identify what this modern valley bottom is. For here, it's basically the dark area that's kind of surrounded by purple and blues and the other colors adjacent to it. So it's basically that darker, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, mauve or something between or surrounding the red and the yellow stream course lines. And that's, I mean, for the Kettle River, it's probably about roughly 280 meters wide there, I think, and the channel's roughly about 80 meters wide, just to put it in perspective. So I'll go to the next slide here, Vanessa. So in addition to those kind of riverine hazards that we see on the Kettle River, we've also looked at some of the fan hazards. So the provincial guideline for flood hazard area land use, which was originally released in, I believe, 2004, provides special conditions for land uses on alluvial fans and that's to account for the dynamic nature of these areas and the hazards that are associated with them. So a lot of times floodplain maps don't necessarily identify these fans on it. However, we have try to identify them and delineate them on this set of map sheets. And then there's a number of fans that we've looked at in a little more detail. And I'll kind of go through this a little bit as we go through here. They can experience a range of hazards, and here I've listed these as events. So you can either have like flooding, like a clear water flood event down the water course, or you could have a debris flood event. And debris flood is basically similar to a normal flood, except that there's a large amount of sediment and debris that's flowing with the flow. And when we're talking sediment, it could be like soils and gravels, but it could be up to boulders and trees that are flowing down with the flow. And then the next item here would be a debris flow, and that's more of a geotechnical hazard. It's kind of like gravity driven more than flow driven. So it's more sediment and more earth and boulders and trees and water's helping to keep things moving. So these types of events, they're triggered by, as a high flow, obviously for flooding events and also for debris floods. And then as you go further on, it can be geotechnical instabilities, particularly for debris flows. And these can be supported, or this instability could be initiated or further triggered, I guess, from erosion of the toe of slopes from the channel or from high flow or high precipitation events. So they often occur during high flow events, regardless of their trigger or the geotechnical portion of it. As well, there's also obstructions or outbreak floods that can occur. So that's basically if there's a landslide or other kind of mass movement that blocks a channel, or a culvert that gets blocked and then stores a lot of water upstream of it. Then when that bursts free and there's like an outbreak flood downstream of it, can cause a lot of damage and challenges. So the hazards that these can initiate or impose on the land downstream is either inundation. So similar to like the clear water flood, you just have water ponding or pooling, but you could also have high velocity flows, which can lead to scour, erosion, and impact of structures. As well, you can have a deposition of sediment and debris, and that can either be on the property or as well as it can be within the channel and help initiate or change channel flows, either through erosion or avulsion, such as a sudden relocation of the channel. And then these figures on the side here is just to illustrate, you can kind of see the fan type shape, which is characteristic of these structures and why they have that name. And that's resulting from successive depositional events with the flow path changing back and forth across that system, and it leaves this kind of fan structure. And then for these sites, we've got the topography shown in kind of like a weird green color, and then we have the water depth shown in like reds and blues. And basically those events that are shown here are from the hydraulic model, a 2D flow model, but it's not of a specific event or design event in particular, but it's more of running through with some extreme flows that could potentially occur with some of these events, but it's mainly used here to inform where there's flow paths are most likely in the event of channel blockages or obstruction, more than using it to specifically map any single event. I guess I'll go to the next slide from there. Thank you. All right, so once we've, so I said what we've done is we've gone through and we've identified the alluvial fans that were adjacent or connecting to the areas that we mapped with the hydraulic floodplain mapping. And then for these 4 fans, we've looked at them in a little bit greater detail. And it's still not the same kind of like detailed analysis that would be conducted if you're going to do a large development on any of these particular sites, or a single large development or what have you. But what we have done is it's based off of a review of a desktop study review of mapping and these modeling results and upstream characterization, as well as some limited site inspections and investigations on the ground on these span locations. And then the way we've characterized these is we've looked at both the hazard, like what's the potential impacts that's going to happen on a particular area, like whether it's high velocity or sediment and debris that we're expecting there, or if it's more ponding or pooling. And then also the likelihood. So what's the likelihood of that event reaching that location of the fan? And then from that, we've classified them or characterized them from low, moderate, high, and very high hazards. Go to the next slide, Vanessa. So this is kind of well, I mean, it's the draft version, but this is where all that work that Vanessa and myself have both been talking about. And it's just illustrating what the maps then show. So on the lower portion of this map, it's looking at the riverine area. And what it's illustrating is there's a number of isolines that you can see that span across the channel. And those indicate the flood construction level. So that's often what's applied to development within that area as the lowest elevation for either the top of a concrete slab or the underside of wooden supporting floor. And then there's also with that is, I believe, the 20-year water line design water level, which is sometimes used for septic system design. And it's also used for just informational purposes. And then also within the same riverine section, there's a dark blue hatched area, and that's what we use to define or delineate the floodway. And what we're defining the floodway as is the area that of the channel and floodplain that are conveying the majority of the flow during a flood. And the reason we want to delineate those areas, this floodway, is because one is it's got the highest velocity and the highest depth, so that makes it the highest hazard in the floodplain, as well as encroachment into the floodway will start to lower the capacity of the channel to convey future floods, and then that can raise flood levels up for upstream properties, as well as increased velocities for adjacent property owners. So it's typically discouraged or prevented that development goes in the floodway. And then further on that riverine area, you can see a yellow polyline that's basically following the river channels, and that's to delineate the high geomorphic hazard, and it's fairly close to the river, as you can see here, and that's reflective of the relatively stable channel that we see in this reach. The lighter blue hatching that goes beyond the floodway is the flood fringe, so that's area that's still expected to be inundated during the design flood event. However, it's not expected to be transporting substantial amounts of flow. And then adjacent to that, you can kind of see, actually, I'll go to the coastal portion after that. So that up at the top part of the river or the map, you can see Kristina Lake. And there along the shoreline, you can see that lighter blue polygon, and that's the wave effects zone that Vanessa has mentioned. There's the red numbers within those wave effect zone is providing the FCL for those locations. And they change as you go along the shoreline based on the fetch. So basically the wave height that's expected to reach there, as well as the shoreline slope and structure. And then the other parts here is the alluvial fan hazard. So the pink I guess hatched area at the bottom right portion of the map is defined as an unclassified alluvial fan or fan hazard. So it's basically an area that's a creeks coming in or tributaries coming into the channel, and that area is identified as an alluvial fan. We haven't classified it. And when I say unclassified, often alluvial fans can be active, meaning that they're still supplied sediment sufficient that the channel may move across that alluvial fan or that landform and potentially result in hazards from that. Whereas if it's some of these fans can be inactive and that the channel's well incised within the alluvial fan and isn't expected to be receiving substantial enough flow or sediment to leave that incised channel. And basically it's been incised since the glaciation and kind of like dropped into that lower location. And so those pink areas are ones that we haven't classified, and we recommend that if someone is going to develop there, that they want to take a look at it in a little bit more detail. And then the yellow, orange, and red area was the alluvial fan or I guess the fan hazard that we identified on that Moody Creek. And that's looking at where there's potential for, as I said, potential for sediment, debris, and channel changes during a large fan event, as well as areas where it's progressively less likely, but still possible as one progresses away from the main channel. And this next slide. Oh, I did have one. Yeah, I was gonna maybe skip that slide. I guess I'll go over it real quick since you kind of already talked about it. But it's basically just an illustration again of the flood construction level. So it's a little simpler on the riverine portion where it's basically just the design flood level and then a freeboard, and that's good. Gives the flood construction level. The freeboard is set here at 0.6 meters above the design flood level. And that's relatively standard in BC for contemporary floodplain maps. When we did the modeling, we did sensitivity analysis. So we were looking at changing the flows and changing things like, as was mentioned a number of times, what the lake level was, as well as changing roughness and other geometry changes, just to kind of see how sensitive the final flood levels are from these changes. And that we look at those results and kind of compare that with the 0.6 meter freeboard to ensure that it's a reasonable allowance for that uncertainty, as well as local variations in water level. And when we're thinking local variations in a river, I mean, everyone here's probably seen some high flows going through in some of these channels, and you can see there's standing waves going by, and there's super elevation of the water along the outside bends. And so that's where that freeboard comes as well, is to help try and address some of those local variations that occur. And then this top figure, it's just kind of showing where the bulk of the flow is conveyed within the floodway. And then the flood fringe is on this side. And what's shown here is the 20-year flood level is often representative of that floodway. You can switch that. So what's next? So basically these floodplain maps are here to provide information, and that information can be used by local residents for preparations for their own property and site. It can be used by emergency response for emergency preparedness, and as well as support land use planning. We got a number of this list again of non-structural and structural flood mitigation measures. A lot of these measures are either supported or informed by these floodplain maps. So it's a kind of a foundational step to mitigate flood risk. Go to the next slide, please. And then I just put this slide up, or I guess there's a couple slides here. It's just on the responsibilities and just kind of outlining that, like, although the regional districts putting out these floodplain maps, it's not really the regional districts, not the only player here for reducing flood risk. I mean, the federal government's role is typically limited to national strategies and funding, such as support floodplain mapping, such as these ones, as well as construction of structural mitigation measures. They often provide funding for that. And in the worst case, like post-disaster recoveries provided or supported by the federal government. However, this is generally limited to uninsurable assets. The provincial government listed here as well. It provides additional funding and guidelines for flood mitigation, as well as forecasting floods, such as the BC River Forecast Center, which is shown on the bottom part of this slide. One of their websites, at least, as well as the snowpack data, which is on the top part of this slide. As well, they provide regulation of dike safety and support emergency response and recovery from floods and other catastrophes and other hazards. Next slide. And then in addition to the federal and provincial government, there's obviously the local government, and they're supporting flood mitigation planning, identifying the flood hazards and land use planning. So that these maps fit within that, identifying the flood hazards, and it can be used later for land use planning, as well as emergency response and evacuation. And then there's the occupants of the floodplain or areas surrounding the floodplain. And these residents and businesses, their responsibility is to know these local hazards and prepare their household or business to withstand these hazards and be able to recover rapidly once they occur and are gone. And then as well, this could be like flood-proofing homes and businesses, or procuring flood insurance, as well as evacuating upon order to do so. There's a number of documents. That's what this figure is actually from, that helps guide residents on what their local preparations can be. That's put out by the province. I think and then that's basically it. It's just that's the conclusions, and if there's any other questions, we'll try and help answer them.
So, hi, so I'm going to be quick. I have 5 slides. So I'm going to talk about the floodplain bylaw and what we have right now and how that might change, and a little bit of background. So so the last time we did the mapping that you see that's leaning up on the poster board against the walls, that's the existing floodplain maps that we have, and they're part of the floodplain bylaw that we have. So in 1991, that's the last time this was mapped. So I don't know, I'm doing the math quickly. It's over 30 years ago. So so the 1995 floodplain bylaw, it was adopted in 1995 based on those 1991 maps. Another milestone was in 2003, 2004. There was a change with the province. So the province, I call it downloading, but they got out of the business of granting variances to the floodplain bylaw, and they gave that to the regional districts. And so we then had to scramble and figure out how we were going to accept those applications and what kind of criteria we would use in order to make those assessments, which is basically providing an engineer's report. And now here we are in 2021, 2022, and we're revising them finally after 30 years. And I don't know if Kristina mentioned it in her presentation, but that it was a significant amount of money that we got from the federal government and the provincial governments. It's in the $750,000 range. That's the cost. Oh, 900. Yeah, almost $1 million. Yeah, those are grants. Those are grants. So it's not paid through your local taxes. I mean, we all pay federal and provincial taxes, so it comes through a higher level of government. Yeah. But it's applied for and then managed by local government staff. So there is that contribution, but we wouldn't have had that, like, without having Kristina's position, we wouldn't have got that grant money, or it would have been a lot harder. Okay, so how do we use those floodplain maps? So one of the things is around subdivision referrals. So now with these new maps, we have new information. We didn't have wave action, so that's a new thing that we have. The actual flood construction level on the lake, if we didn't have the wave action, it went up 10 centimeters. So, and this is, like I said, it's still draft, and like everyone said, but the alluvial fans, that's all new information. I mean, we knew from looking at the maps that there were fans, because you can see that, that shape on the landscape. And that's obviously where people build. So there's a lot of settlement in those areas. But we also know that they're high risk, and this is proving a lot of that out. So we use it in long range planning. So as a lot of you will know, the official community plan is being reviewed right now, and that's Liz's work right now, that she's working on that long range plan. And so a lot of that hazard information, that's one of the things that's required that we include in official community plans. So the alluvial fans and any other hazards. Also used in building permits, and we touched on that a bit with Robert. There have been questions to Robert about that and how that works. So people can apply. You can apply for an exemption. It's usually for setbacks. So the setback from Kristina Lake for the floodplain is 7.5 meters. So you have your flood construction level and you have your 7.5 meter setback. So for well, I shouldn't say most of the area, but we saw the maps earlier that Kristina presented that shows where we have floodplain mapping. If we don't have floodplain mapping, then there are some standards, like on the Kettle River, it's a 30-meter setback and 3 meters above the natural boundary, and other smaller systems or creeks or streams, it's a 15-meter setback and a 1.5 meters above the flood construction, or above the natural boundary, sorry. And then we also use it in our emergency response. So during the 2018 flood, we were using house numbers. That's part of the reason why we put all the house numbers actually on top of the roofs, not physically on top of the roofs, but it was a mapping exercise so that we knew exactly where all the houses were, so that then when we have to plan for evacuations or evacuation alerts, we know where the people that need to be evacuated and included in our notices. And that might be my last slide. And then that leads into, I think I already talked about that, and leads into Freya.
Hi, everyone. I'm Freya Phillips, the Senior Energy Specialist with the RDKB. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of our new Climate Action Plan, which was approved by the board on the 12th of October. A number of you have probably participated in the public consultation that we undertook. So this plan has been developed based on research, background information. We did a hazard and risk and vulnerability assessment to look at the impacts of climate change on our region, which was based off the work that Mark does around emergency management. They do one, and we layered on climate projections to look out to 2050 to see what those kind of key risks were for our region as well. There was an inventory developed, but most importantly, there was what we think is quite strong engagement around the development. So we ran stakeholder and staff workshops. We did our public outreach and surveying, and also had a couple of workshops with the board as well as kind of numerous internal discussions. And most importantly, we actually at this stage developed what was called a technical advisory group that oversaw the development of it. And this plan really does bring together the activities that we've been doing for some time on climate change, as well as how we're mitigating, how we're preparing and adapting. So credit has to go to that tag team, which consisted of Mark from emergency management, Donna obviously from planning and development, as well as Goran Devacek, who is the manager of infrastructure and sustainability, and definitely a call out to Kristina, who also provided very valuable insights as well and information. So our climate action plan, it's really about building off and bringing together the work that's actually already been undertaken. And we'll have a quick look at that quite impressive array of things that have been done. So not only have we been looking at how we can reduce our energy and climate impact, but also how we can prepare and adapt. So this plan really brings that together. In 2019, one of the reasons for moving forward with this climate action plan was in 2019, the board declared a climate action imperative. And what that was really doing was, one, recognizing the impact of climate change on our region. And I don't need to tell you, as we're sitting here talking about floodplain mapping, around that impact in 2018, but also we've seen wildfires, we've seen drought. Kristina's been working on the drought management, and last year we were the first region to actually move to level 5 drought. So for us, we need to respond to that, but it's not just for us as a local government, it's across all levels of government that need to act. And as I said, like we've taken a slightly different approach to this plan. It's what they're calling, the buzzword is low carbon resilience. And so what we're trying to do is look at how we can reduce our emissions and also how we can prepare and adapt. And there's lots of activities in the middle which really overlap both of those. And the reason for doing that is looking at how we can get what we call co-benefits. So we're looking at, for example, looking at somebody's home renovation. We look at things like energy efficiency. We look at how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But we also need to be thinking about how we can build that more resiliently as well. I'm not going to go into detail, but for me, this kind of gives us a little bit of history of how and what we've been doing over the time. You can't read it, I recognize that, but I would encourage you to go and have a look in the actual plan. But you can see over the time how we've actually been ramping up our activities. So blue is on the mitigation side and green is looking at how we're adapting and preparing. And you can definitely see how we've been resourcing up and doing a lot more activities as well. Oh, sorry. So as part of this plan, we developed what we call our vision for climate action. It's what does our region look like when we're looking long term, and how are we managing the impacts of climate and also helping prepare for it as well. So for us, it was about creating a region that provides opportunity and, importantly, access to everyone to live, work and play in a low carbon manner. And building off that is really about working together to create a resilient and sustainable community that enables residents and businesses to adapt to our changing climate and and protecting and enhancing our natural environment, which also helps with that management of climate change. Behind the climate the climate plan, these guiding principles, and this was actually signed off by the board and allowed us to really prioritize what activities and actions we actually do. And the first one is very much around leadership, and for us as a region and for us as an organization to lead by example as well. We can't be asking people to do things unless we're actually demonstrating how it can actually be done. Practical and actionable. And this is really some of the discussion we had was there's lots of plans out there which are kind of a bit cookie cutter, and much of the actions are coming from urban environments and kind of the lower mainland. And for us and the board, we're really quite strong on this. We have to understand this is a rural context and understand what we can actually do. And when we're doing our public consultation, we got some amazing feedback around what people were concerned about, but also how they're managing and what they're doing around climate change, and also how they're actually making steps forward to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as well. So we've tried to capture some of those within the plan as well. Really important, especially at the moment, as we talk about being fair, equitable, and affordable. You know, we look at our region and we need to make sure there is a lens when we're looking at different activities we're doing, recognizing, it has to be affordable as well, and looking at how we can make sure people have access to information and funding that's actually out there as well. Collaboration, much more efficient, much more effective to all work together on the causes. Ambition, which I thought was actually personally really fantastic to see. But again, it has to link in with those other principles, and also recognizing the approach we're taking needs to look at what other benefits there are. and health and wellness as well. So the 6 climate action areas that we came up with for the plan, and this was based, as I said, on the risk and vulnerability assessment, looking at how we're actually going to be mitigating climate change and making those steps forward. The first one was around organizational leadership. And as I said, we need to lead by example. The second one was around buildings and properties. And sorry, behind these action areas is kind of a goal that we've written, and also the actions around how we're going to move forward and deliver those. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on reading out each of the goals, but if you do get the time, please do look. So properties and buildings. So this is where obviously the floodplain mapping sits in under that. Water and waste. You know, we've got targets around zero waste already in place and how we can move towards that. We're also looking at how we can use water responsibly as well and efficiently. Transport, land use and infrastructure, industry and livelihoods. And again, this is covering our businesses within the area, so it's super important, and our ecosystems as well. And just to conclude, obviously, it's great having a plan, but it actually has to be implemented as well. So coming out, and this is just, it's a little hard to read again, but it's just to give you an example around when we were developing the action plans, we were looking at obviously the different categories, what the actual actions were, what role RDKB has. So not everything's within our jurisdiction, and you'll see within the plan, they're all for us to do, but within the plan, there's things like advocacy. So we may not have jurisdiction over something, but we can advocate to the province around making sure things are actually moving forward and aligned with our plan, and also what they've come out with from a Clean BC perspective and adaptation and preparedness strategy. Timeframes, responsible departments, but we also need to look at what the resources are associated with that. Is it already part of one of the services kind of plans, or do we need to actually raise funding for them as well? So for us, we're going to be tracking these. Sorry, I have that responsibility, but also doing monitoring and reporting, because we need to be transparent around how we're actually progressing and also make sure that we're understanding how we're moving forward. We also have a responsibility to report to the province on an annual basis as well. So that's our very quick snapshot. There's a lot more. I would encourage you to have a quick look on our website. And if anyone has any questions.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Stevens. I'm the manager of emergency programs at the Regional District Kootenay Boundary. We have a full hazard emergency program in the regional district. We cover areas from Fruitvale over in the east, all the way over to Bridesville and Mount Baldy and Big White in the north over on the west. So quite a large area. We cover all the electoral areas as well as municipalities, and we cover all the hazards that could affect them. So today I'm going to keep it relatively short. I know we're kind of closing in on time. Just quickly talk about the roles and responsibilities of the RDKB emergency program. We're going to talk about how we communicate, evacuations, and some personal preparedness messaging as well. So roles and responsibility of the regional district. So when we talk about a flooding event, we talk about, we're looking at kind of 3 areas: the pre-flood, the during the flood, and the recovery from. And so pre-flood, we're really monitoring our conditions. We're working with our stakeholders and our other ministries that we liaise with. So Forest Lands Natural Resource, BC River Forecast Center, Emergency Management British Columbia, and you can see the list there. We also produce a lot of content as well. So up there, you can see this is a copy of our Boundary Freshet dashboard. I'm not sure if you've seen this before. During freshet season, as we get close, we start publishing these on a regular regular basis. Usually starts out kind of once a month sort of thing, then to once a week, and then kind of picks up from there as we see the need to. It's really just a snapshot in time of what we're monitoring on the rivers, giving you the information that you need, as well as the sources that we're looking for. All the blue text up there are hyperlinks that link to the actual data sources. You can go and start monitoring those yourself if you wish. You can see all the data that we're looking at in the same way. This is published to our emergency website, which is emergency.rdkb.com. You can access it there and updated on a regular basis. We also make lots of media posts. Social media is our primary means of getting information out, as well as our website, and sometimes through traditional media as well. As we get to during the flood, we've kind of recognized that we are going to have a flood. We'll actually stand up our emergency operations center. We have a number of different levels that can happen at. A level 1 is just monitoring conditions, maybe 1 or 2 people kind of taking some actions, very minor threat to people or property. And then we have what's called a level 3+. This is an example of what that room might look like. 30+ people in a room, all working together on a common goal of eliciting evacuations, getting people out of the way, and working on recovery aspects as well. We're very much coordinating with all other government ministries as well, trying to build an operational picture of what's happening. We have a number of plans that we'll also be utilizing in these times. We have our evacuation plans that we use, basically telling us how much time it takes to get a neighborhood out of the area. We also have our flood response plan that we utilize to determine when we need to, install tiger dams, gabion baskets or sandbags, things of that nature. Also really tells us about when we need to start being concerned with snowpacks and river levels and things like that. We can also deploy emergency support services. This is our branch of the emergency program that takes care of people. During an evacuation, residents in British Columbia are entitled to 72 hours of support if they need it, ranging from accommodation, clothes and incidentals, as well as food, to name a few. And then we also start planning for things like rapid damage assessment. We need to assess areas to see if they are damaged, and then how best to get people back into that. Anyone who was here for 2018 may have seen one of those placards on their house, red, orange, or green, basically just explaining the level of damage to the house and what might need to be done to do that, to get back into that. And we also create re-entry plans and packages for people. Anyone who's evacuated from an area will get a re-entry package from us, basically talking about the different hazards, even if there's no damage to your property, what can happen, different ministries and organizations to communicate with to determine what might be there, how to get rid of a fridge, for example, power outages, gas, things of that nature. And then post-flood. So now we enter the recovery phase. We're looking at really building back what we can do for people. Disaster financial assistance is one way that we help that. That's really for uninsured losses. So for example, it's not a replacement for insurance. It's really I wasn't eligible for flood insurance, therefore we can apply to see if the province will step in and cover those costs for people. But it is not an insurance policy. Anyone who has gone through a DFA process understands that it's not the funnest thing to be a part of, but it is there in some cases. And then we are also starting to communicate the current level of risk. There are chances that you may have to be evacuated again. We've had situations like that. Our goal is to get you back into your house as fast as we can, and then have you leave again if we need to leave. I know I'm going kind of fast through this. I'm just cognizant of time. I will be here after, and I have lots of cards I can hand out if you need to talk to me after as well. So emergency communication. So during an event or lead up to an event, we're going to be communicating in a number of ways. Any evacuation alerts and orders are always sent out through our evacuation alerting system. This system right here is a very quick way of alerting people. We can do that through email, voice calls, text messages, as well as the app to alert you of an evacuation order or alert on your property. We also, if it's not an order, we also hand that out in person. Alerts are published to the media. When we are communicating with you, we're doing social media, Facebook, Twitter are our primary sources of that. We also issue press releases for evacuation alerts and critical communication. That's usually picked up by traditional media sources, local radio. We also will utilize police, fire, and search and rescue to go door to door, knocking on doors if we need to do that as well. I thought it was very critical to show this. This is the stages of evacuation. We primarily try to follow this whenever we can. If there is time before an emergency, especially fresh out, we can kind of see these things coming. We'll issue an evacuation alert. This is that's over on the far left there. That's really, we're notifying you that we're seeing hazards coming. We're being advised by experts and subject matter experts that it could be a risk to your life or property. Please prepare to leave your property at a moment's notice. Grab the 5 Ps, people, pets, prescriptions, paper, important papers and pictures, and be ready to leave. Then if we issue an order, we will try to make every effort to get to your house, to knock on the door and provide this documentation. This is a legal documentation process, as we're required to leave it at your residence, as well as our electronic communication methods. And this is that you are at risk. We need you to leave right away, sort of thing. And then at the end of that, we have an evacuation rescind. Once again, you'll get a notification and we let you know that, okay, the emergency is now clear. You can now come back and a reentry package is issued at that point. One thing that I will say is we are very good over the last number of years of issuing reentry permits. So if an evacuation goes on longer, we have a process by which we can get you back into your house temporarily if you need to, check on something, pick up some important prescriptions or papers that may have been left. We are able to facilitate some access when safe to do so, as detailed by our subject matter experts in that area. If you are a farmer or a rancher in a commercial operation, we have those processes as well to make sure that you can be on the property safely while taking care of your animals. And then finally, talk about some personal preparedness stuff. So our website, emergency.rdkb.com, is your best source to be linked to all of it. It is a little bit all over the place. On the provincial website, we kind of put it all together for you so that it's nice and easy to pull there. So I have some of the resources pertaining to floods right there. The most important thing is to have a plan, have a home plan for yourself and your family. Where are you going to go? What are you going to take? How are you going to get there? How are you going to communicate with people? Have all your stuff packed and ready to go if you need to at the key seasons that may affect you. If you know you're in a floodplain, or if you know that you're in an area that's prone to flooding, that's the best time to do it. In the spring, have a box, a Rubbermaid tub next to your door ready to go. Easy to take that out the door if you need to. And that's that grab and go kit. Getting that out the door in a short order of time really will help you reduce that stress when that evacuation order comes. And then protecting your home and property. There was some questions about building permits and all that. We really, unfortunately, in the EOC, we aren't able to protect private property. We aren't able to go out and sandbag individual properties. We can provide sandbag stations, which is what we do. We have done in this spring as well. It was the last spring in 2022 and in 2020 as well. We do provide those sandbag stations, but we do not have the staff resources to sandbag individual houses. We sandbag critical infrastructure, and in some cases larger areas, but we don't have the ability to do that. So we help to facilitate that through sandbagging stations, and we are also always available to provide some comments on where you can get flood protection assets if you require or if you wish to do that. And with that, I will end it and just thank everyone for coming and listening to our presentations tonight.